Hello again. I'm Dr. Parme Giuntini from Otis College of Art and Design, and this is the second half of Impressionism. Last time, I talked about Impressionism from the perspective of new techniques and subject matter. And I was really talking about what modern critics and scholars thought. Today, we're going to look at what postmodern scholars are arguing about Impressionism. That is, art historians who are writing from the 1960s on. They have different questions, different priorities, and a very different interpretation about a lot of Impressionist paintings that can no longer be considered just pretty pictures.
Last time, we talked about the factors that distinguished Impressionism as an avant-garde movement in terms of formal issues and subject matter. We also identified some of the reasons that the Academy and conservative critics disliked Impressionist painting. Today we are going to look more closely at issues of interpretation, specifically at what scholars interested in social history theory and gender theory are saying. These are disciplinary positions that have been developed post-1960, and they reflect a different range of questions about art and the artist. These scholars put more emphasis on context, on causal relationships between art and other kinds of cultural production, and on the way that art functions in society to shape and reflect ideas and issues. They also look at the ways that mainstream cultural ideas can marginalize or mask positions that challenge the status quo. Changes in scholarship are common in any field. As new and different theories are developed and new information discovered, scholars respond with different questions, and they often come to new conclusions. In the modern period, when the Impressionists were painting, there was a widespread belief that with science and rational thinking, people could find concrete answers, answers that everyone would agree to regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, or culture. That was one of the driving forces of modern art and modernity, and one of the reasons that progress was held in such high esteem. In particular, artists were looking for a universal approach to art, a criteria or a style that would work for everyone. It is one of the reasons for the increasing interest in abstraction and de-emphasis on representational painting and sculpture. The former was understood as more universal, and the latter as more specific to a particular culture or group. In the postmodern period, which is where we are today, the prevailing belief is that there are many answers, many different interpretations, many different positions on everything, and they exist simultaneously. We no longer consider it necessary for everyone to agree to a single interpretation, and we understand that what people decide to believe is often the result of what they privilege, what they decide is most important, what their experience or training or culture has been. Let's start off with Impressionist subject matter and see how a different approach influences the interpretation of a painting. Boulevard des Capucines and The Luncheon of the Boating Party are two paintings we've looked at before. You'll remember that Impressionists painted the modern world, which eliminated literary and historical subjects but favored everyday life. Paintings of cities, their homes and gardens, their families and friends, all manner of leisure activities from boating to the theater and ballet, the city, the countryside, buildings they walked past, and places they visited were all viable subjects for a modern artist. From our perspective of over 100 years, a painting of a street or one of a group of friends lunching at a restaurant seems very ordinary. We accept it as a modern subject and often move along to focus on the stylistic issues, since they seem much more innovative. That is precisely what art historians did for decades. They focused on formal elements and the gradual trajectory from highly representational painting to abstraction. That is one way of looking at a painting or a sculpture, but not the only way. What happens if we take a closer look at the subject of Impressionist paintings, if we consider the cultural context in which they were made and the contemporary audiences for them? Why these streets? Why this kind of a group? Why not factories or back alleys? Why these people? Perhaps their choice of subject had less to do with issues of fine art and more with cultural concerns. Let's start with Boulevard des Capucines. Paris was truly the first modern city, and by the time that the Impressionists were painting in the 1860s, this modern Paris had been recreated as the result of the Second Empire under Louis Napoleon. He dissolved the Second Republic in 1852 and declared himself Napoleon III, beginning yet another imperial empire. He immediately enlisted the services of Baron Haussmann, who began to redesign Paris, a process that took about 20 years and produced the first recognizably modern city in Europe. The process came to be known as the Haussmannization of Paris. These renovations involved massive demolition of much of Paris, including the destruction of the city's historical center. The new Paris was designed to be a haven for bourgeois urbanites, eager to patronize the new restaurants, cafes, bars, theaters, and shops. The first department store, the Bon Marché, was opened in Paris. Retail shops and cafes lined the new streets, which were widened to accommodate crowds and carriage traffic more efficiently. Sewers were installed, along with gas lighting. Hundreds of trees were planted down the meridians. A central cab company was formed, and large new police stations were built. Railroads and train stations linked Paris with small towns and leisure spots where even the working class people like shopgirls and clerks and factory workers, could take day excursions cheaply. This beautiful new Paris, with large, comfortable apartments, open parks for strolling, broad boulevards with unfettered views, was accomplished at the expense of eradicating the poor neighborhoods and many of the small working class shops. Moving the poor and working classes outside the heart of the city was a strategic political move, since historically they had been the dissidents. The new wide streets were impossible to barricade, which meant the military and the police could move freely and easily within the city. These were important changes to the new government, which remembered the major civil uprisings of 1830 and 1848, when Parisians had rebelled and barricaded the streets to thwart the army. This was the new Paris that most of the Impressionists grew up in. Pissarro and Cassatt excepted, since they were born and raised outside of France. This is the Paris celebrated in 1867 as the site of the Exposition Universelle, a World's Fair intended to highlight the city and its accomplishments. Edouard Manet's painting clearly shows the well-dressed middle classes enjoying the view, and he even included uniformed French military at the right, perhaps a reminder that new barracks had also been built in the city and there was a strong military presence. The only working-class person is a gardener in the foreground, and he is turned away from the spectacle, perhaps a reminder of his class and his function in this new modern city. Within 3 years, though, the country would be caught up in the disastrous Franco-Prussian War. Although Napoleon III and his entire army were captured in September of 1870, fighting continued under a newly formed French Third Republic. They were not successful at holding off the Prussians, however, which had superior artillery and more soldiers. When the Prussians laid siege to Paris, the Third Republic government escaped to Versailles, leaving the city in the de facto control of the National Guard, which was mostly workers, some professionals, and ended up being organized by French communists. After the Prussians left Paris in March of 1871, these local leaders declared Paris a commune and completely independent from France. It was a short-lived rebellion, 73 days, and when the government regained control and re-entered Paris, they took swift and brutal retaliation. The new city of Paris, with its wide streets, was much harder to defend and impossible to blockade. Outnumbered and outgunned, the communards were overwhelmed by the military. The fighting was brutal, and that was only the beginning. Until the Warsaw Uprising in 1943, the Commune was the largest urban insurrection in modern Europe. Between 25 and 30,000 people were killed in the last days of street fighting in May, a moment immediately known as Bloody Week. The French government retaliated with 50,000 prison sentences, 4,000 deportations, and 2,000 executions. There was a tremendous loss of private and state property, and major parts of Paris, which had been remodeled under Napoleon III, were now in ruins. Most of the destroyed property belonged to the bourgeois, since the Commune participants had attacked private property. What influence did the still fresh memories of invasion, civil unrest, death, and destruction have on Impressionist art? Unlike some realists who were unabashed in their interest to depict the underside of Parisian life, the Impressionists concentrated on subjects curiously detached from conflict. Most of the impressions were what we would describe as apolitical. Again, a huge difference from Courbet and Millet. Even from the earlier 19th century romanticists, Géricault and Delacroix, who never shied away from politically motivated painting. Of course, most of the Impressionists were bourgeois themselves, so their sympathies were with the government rather than with the workers. Camille Pissarro was the only Impressionist to sympathize with the Commune. The others had all fled Paris, and in some cases fled France to escape the war. Even if they had not been in Paris during the war, on their return, they walked through neighborhoods that were now destroyed. They read newspaper accounts of punishments, and they were aware that many working-class Parisians were still angry and discontented. What other kinds of conclusions can we draw from what the Impressionists painted or chose to paint? Albert Boehm argues that many Impressionist paintings can be understood as healing images, attempts by the artist to reconstruct Paris life as safe and peaceful again, free from class strife. Think of those crowded street scenes like Boulevard des Capucines. He painted what had been the site of bloody combat, but was now filled with citizens walking or taking carriages. There is no sign of discomfort or unease among the various classes, and from his perspective on that high balcony, little difference among the figures below. Those black spits of color so derided by the critics signified a jostling crowd of eager shoppers, sharing the street without discord. The artist has even included a bright bunch of balloons in the lower right. What could be a better signifier of healing and peace and frivolity than balloons? Boehm notes that painters were careful to select city views that eliminated sites where the evidence of destruction still remained. Generally, they adopted vantage points in the city that allowed them to focus on rebuilt areas. Monet's sketchy style and rapid painting, with its elimination of specific detail, generalized the city image. It was the overview, the sensation of a bustling city culture that the artist communicated. Boehm calls attention to city scenes that Monet painted featuring the June 30th celebrations of 1878 as especially important. Not only are they densely populated with throngs of people, far more than in any of his other city views, but they are filled with the French flag. This was an important event, the first time that the Third Republic had celebrated a national holiday. These were also two streets that had been home to working-class neighborhoods and the scenes of fierce fighting during Bloody Week. Now that Impressionist brushstroke connects the sketchily painted figures, the structures, and hundreds of flags into an organic whole, They bleed into one another as though they are intimately entwined and perfectly harmonious. The artist's rapid brushstroke and its inevitable lack of detail convey the sense of spectacle, the rush of the crowd, the wind that lifts the countless flags into continual motion. Whatever memories of loss and death those cities held has been refashioned into one of glorious celebration. And the Impressionist style was critical to communicating that sense of immediacy and authenticity. Boehm makes another interesting argument for the countless scenes of parks and family gardens that were so popular with Impressionist artists. Monet painted a number of canvases of the Parc Monceau, its grounds dappled with sunlight and visitors and glimpses of elegant residences seen through the trees. However, it had been a commune base and the site of mass executions. Painting it as a tranquil leisure site where bourgeois families with young children could stroll in absolute safety was one way to eradicate the horrific memories associated with the park. Boehm goes on to note that Impressionist delight in gardens and intimate family scenes of leisure were yet another way to reassure the middle-class audiences of the sanctity of private property which the communards had attacked. I have focused on the works of Monet because his are so well known, but most of the Impressionists did both garden and family scenes, so he was not an anomaly. These Impressionist paintings may have functioned as one way to visually disassociate Paris from wartime memories, reframing French life as modern, safe, thriving, and upwardly mobile would have resonated with the bourgeois class, and as Boehm notes, the paintings would then function as healing images. Beyond their aesthetic value, beyond the academic concern over brushstrokes and style, these paintings communicated in a vital and understandable way the great progress that Parisians had made. Issues of class have been critically important to scholars since the 1960s, which is why so much work has focused on representational art like Impressionist paintings, where modern life was the primary subject. In a large city, class is always on display, and how the Impressionists painted Parisians can be indicative of mainstream attitudes. This appears to be the case in Renoir's Moulin de la Galette of 1876, where he paints one of the newly popular public dance sites that was well attended by working class and lower middle class Parisians. These were the shop girls and clerks, the factory workers and domestic servants who enjoyed the affordable entertainment. It's a warm summer night in a large crowd that the artist has painted, but nearly all the men are wearing suits and fashionable straw boaters, and the young women, especially those that are in the foreground, are outfitted in equally fashionable gowns. These are clear clues to a secure economy, to factories producing goods and consumers buying them. They are also strong indicators about the interests of a largely working-class audience whose priorities have been redirected from dissatisfaction with the government to more personally satisfying goals: leisure, gaiety, and romance. Again, the closely packed crowd and the sketchy brushstrokes act as unifying elements. We can almost read the crowd as one entity that is smiling, dancing, enjoying the evening and each other. Any reference to the unpleasant past has been expunged through consumption and color. Using that methodology, Renoir's painting, Luncheon of the Boating Party, seems far more complicated than a simple restaurant scene. The figures in the foreground are clearly working class, and the artist has demonstrated that by painting two of the men wearing undershirts, one of whom straddles the chair. It is a collegial group. They all seem to be having fun, right down to the young woman who cuddles a cat on the table. But it does seem that the artist is letting us know that despite the inappropriate dress, no middle-class gentleman would appear in public in his undershirt, and an animal on the table. The rest of the customers, including the bourgeois men identified by their dark suits and top hats, are unconcerned. It's not an issue. Class seems to have taken a backseat to collegiality. If anything, the different patrons seem rather jammed together and not minding at all. Considering that late 19th century French society had rather rigid rules for all kinds of social interactions, including where you sat in a restaurant, and that class lines were still very important, a fact that the artist knew very well, this representation of leisure activity and class intermingling seems an optimistic cultural comment as well as an artistic one. Until the 1970s and feminist scholarship, the notion of modernity as it was written about and pictured was unconsciously understood to be a masculine experience. Modernity was technology, capitalism, industrialization. It was bars and saloons, street life and street walkers. Baudelaire clearly understood the modern experience to be that of the man on the street, the flaneur, who is able to move through all the public spaces, both the polite, like the opera, the theater, the home and the park, and the vulgar, bars, saloons, cafes, brothels. Not surprisingly, that is the way that the male Impressionist painters depicted modern life, both in their choice of subject, which could be anything, and from their vantage point, which was definitely masculine. Degas' works are exemplary in demonstrating this, since he really focused on painting modern life through human activity, and that could be leisure, but it was often work. Additionally, he focused on women, and he painted many working-class women, such as you see in these two examples of women ironing and the absinthe drinker. Typical of Degas' work is a noticeable detachment from the figures and the scene, as though he is a voyeur into the lives of his subjects, catching them at odd moments. One of the laundresses is stretching and yawning, one arm around a tall bottle, the other behind her head. It is clear from her clothing that she is not wearing a corset, which would have been mandatory for a bourgeois woman. She doesn't know he's watching, so she can be very natural and a little bit awkward. The absinthe drinker may be a new term for you. Absinthe was a popular 19th century drink that is no longer available since it causes severe addiction. Degas has painted what seems to be a young working-class woman sitting alone in a bar, feet rather ungainly splayed, and a blank expression on her face. I don't think that we are supposed to assume that the man sitting next to her is an escort or even that they know each other, since there is nothing in her posture to indicate any familiarity with him. If anything, she seems rather despondent, lost in her own world, unaware of being watched. In both cases, Degas depicts working-class life, and not in any appealing way. Certainly there is none of the frivolity of Renoir's group. A key factor, however, is that Degas could walk into the working areas of a Parisian laundry or a bar. He could go anywhere, paint anyone of his class or not, without any danger to his reputation. The two subjects most associated with Degas are ballerinas and women bathing, and in both cases they represent a specific 19th century gendered male approach to modern subjects, and they offer a startling contrast to what the female Impressionists could or would paint. Let's start with ballerinas. Degas made sketches of them, pastels, oils, and numerous small clay maquettes, which were only cast after his death. Regardless of the size or the medium, he usually focused on them rehearsing, either on stage or in practice rooms. These were times closed to the public, so his access to them was more personal. He preferred oblique angles, which some scholars suggest was the influence of photography. But the result is a more intimate depiction of the dancers, since they seem natural rather than posed. We get a glimpse of them, He often showed them bending over, adjusting their point shoes, lounging, or even in awkward positions, which, like the oblique angles, tended to dissolve their glamour and increase the sense that they were unaware of his presence. For girls today, taking a ballet class, whether or not they have any intention of dancing professionally, is considered fairly typical behavior, almost a rite of passage. There is no stigma attached to ballet lessons or to the figure-revealing clothes worn. This was not the case in the 19th century. Ballerinas generally came from working-class families, since dancing on stage, wearing skimpy costumes that exposed their legs, and endless practicing was considered inappropriate behavior for middle-class females. Undeniably, there was eroticism associated with the ballerina, and it was not uncommon for these dancers to become the mistresses of wealthy men. Part of the attraction that Degas' work had was the subject and her associations with sexuality and availability, with the attention paid to her body, which was ultimately on public display during a performance. His preference for painting ballerinas in places and poses that were never part of their public life heightened the intimacy and appeal of the images for a male audience. Another typical subject in the late 19th century was the female nude. Academic artists consistently painted and exhibited them, and as long as they were couched in the historicizing associations of history painting, their eroticism was both expected and appreciated. However, neither of the academic examples you are looking at communicated the sense of intimacy and sexuality as Degas' painting of women bathing, where the voyeuristic perspective is even more pronounced than in his ballerina pictures. Baudelaire had already identified the three places that a modern woman was naked: in the bath, in the boudoir, and in the brothel. Unlike the ballerina pictures, where the artist often included large expanses of stage or rehearsal space and frequently represented ballerinas in groups, his bathers are nearly always a single figure, represented at close range with very little background, usually a small portable tub, a towel, occasionally part of a dresser. The angles are more oblique and the poses consistent with all the expected movements of bathing, some of which are awkward given the small size of the tub. The woman is often shown bent over or with her back arched, washing her back or a leg, drying her neck, combing her hair. There is little attempt to idealize the figures or the poses, so what emerges is a work that communicates a very personal and private activity that is taking place under the male gaze. The male gaze has become critical to any discussion of Western art, art making, and the representation of the female by male artists, and that constitutes a lot of Western art. It is a late 20th century term associated with feminist and gender theory, where looking is constructed as an active male experience, being looked at as a passive female one. Although it was not used in the 19th century, there is little doubt that women were very aware that their world, their society, their lives were governed by men. They were conscious about their dress, their activities, their behavior, and their reputations. The feminist scholar Griselda Pollock argues that modernity was experienced differently by women in the 19th century and consequently painted differently by the female Impressionists. A bourgeois woman may have driven her own small barouche, but she would have been accompanied by a footman. Mary Cassatt understood that very well when she painted this picture. There was no female equivalent to the flaneur, who had the freedom of the city without any danger to his reputation. True, working-class women did walk the streets of Paris alone, but not bourgeois women. They were considered ladies. That term was an indication of class, and ladies were always chaperoned or escorted when in public. The spaces pictured by female Impressionists are gendered female: dining rooms, bedrooms, private gardens, loges, the spaces that they controlled within the home. Rather than use paid models, they tended to have their families and friends pose for them. Scholars today have identified a variety of ways in which both artists represented specific aspects of modernity that other women would have recognized. For example, they paid more attention than men to details of fashionable dress and domestic furnishing, deportment, manners, and upper-class etiquette, details that they were familiar with and which females from the same class would have instinctively recognized. Cassotte sitters wear fashionable clothing, sit in a room with new wallpaper and upholstery, and know that it is appropriate to raise your pinky finger when sipping tea. Like other bourgeois women, these artists were more influenced by advertising and fashion, which targeted women as the primary consumers. They paid attention to seasonal changes in clothes, to new interior design, to proper etiquette. Berthe Morisot painted her sister Edma wearing fashionable at-home clothing and affectionately peering into her child's cradle. That particular style of rocking cradle, white painted wrought iron with a single post and filmy drapery, was the most fashionable new furniture for the nursery, and the composition of the painting closely mirrors a contemporary ad for the same cradle. The absence of bars, race courses, open street scenes, cafes, and those practice rooms filled with ballerinas in the work of Cassotte and Morisot corresponds to their avoidance of such areas in everyday life. The very spaces of modernity that all men could easily enter were closed to them. Entering a bar or a workspace, like a laundry or a brothel, would have been an enormous breach of decorum. They certainly attended the ballet, but they did not paint ballet dancers. Their pictured sites are not only gendered, they are classed. Only rarely did Cassotte and Morisot paint domestic scenes that included a working woman. And in these instances, the working women were usually pictured within the domestic interior of a bourgeois class home. That is the case with Morisot's painting In the Dining Room, which depicts a housemaid who is very properly corseted and safe within the confines of the artist's own home. It is telling to look at how gender and cultural conventions influenced these artists when they painted the same subject as their male peers. Both Mary Cassotte and Pierre-Auguste Renoir painted women in loge scenes. Loges were the comfortable, high-priced theater and ballet boxes preferred by the wealthy. However, they chose quite different interpretations. Cassotte depicted two young debutantes making one of their first public appearances, which signaled that they were now available for courting and marriage, which their parents hoped would take less than a year or two. She represented them with beautiful but anxious faces, holding onto the bouquets tightly and closely pressed together in the loge. She understood and painted the concern that young women felt when they were literally on display. She showed them as nervous to be the object of attention and yet anxious to receive the right kind of attention. Renoir's Loge of 1874 is dramatically different. He chose to paint a worldly, sophisticated couple and showed a beautiful and elegantly dressed woman sharing the loge with an escort in evening clothes. He calls attention to her lips and breasts with both color and swirling breaststroke. It's hard to look away. We do not know their relationship, and we cannot assume that this is her husband. She sits erect, looking out over the throng of people, quite aware that she is the center of attention and apparently unconcerned. Like the young girls, she too is on display, and her escort, who may be her lover, is using his opera glasses to survey the room, as interested in looking as in showing off his attractive female companion. Both Morisot and Cassotte struggled with their roles as modern artists, literally founding members of the Impressionist movement and the very real boundaries that their class and culture demanded. This applied strictly to subject matter and public space, what they could paint and where they could go. Ironically, although Mary Cassatt never married, she is most known for her paintings of mothers and children, a subject that her friend, Degas, suggested she pursue because he thought it would be profitable and appropriate for her. Less familiar to American audiences, but more intriguing in many ways than Mary Cassatt, is Berthe Morisot. From a wealthy bourgeois family, both she and her sister Edma wanted to be painters. Edma stopped painting after she married and began a family, which was quite typical for female artists. From all accounts, Berthe Morisot was far more determined to continue painting and disappointed that her sister had not. Nor did it hurt that Morisot's brother-in-law was the well-known painter Edouard Manet, who encouraged her in her work. Most of Morisot's paintings are domestic scenes for which family and friends posed, and she made many, many paintings of her daughter Julie through all the stages of her life, but the artist grappled with the subject of the female nude. Whether or not Morisot wanted to paint the nude is less of an issue than the fact that it was not considered appropriate for her as a woman to do so, and that she was discouraged from doing this. The complicating factor is that the nude was considered the tour de force of academic art, the foundational figure. Not being allowed to paint the nude shifted attention away from your artistic ability to your gender. Morisot's concerns about painting the female nude are well documented. We know that she had to hire models, since she couldn't ask family or friends to disrobe, and she disliked working with these paid models. She was uncomfortable being around women who were not dressed, and that would have been typical for most middle-class women of that time. A bourgeois woman like Morisot had little experience being around naked women, and she herself would have been seen naked only by her husband and her maid, who would have helped her bathe and dress. Woman at her toilette and Psyche are among her earliest attempts to work with what I am going to call the less dressed figure. These are certainly not nudes. In fact, Morisot never painted a fully nude woman, but they are women in a state of undress, and that in itself was a leap. It is telling to look at what she includes in these paintings in order to reframe the model and the picture as less working class and more bourgeois. These are not the cramped rooms of Degas' bathers. Instead, she paints them in the private space of a boudoir, part of a suite of rooms in the 19th century in which bourgeois women dressed and entertained very close friends. She alludes to that specific class association with expensive and fashionable touches, like a freestanding cheval mirror, matching drapery and sofa fabrics, flowered carpeting, the full-length glass balcony doors with their billowy curtains, patterned wallpaper, shelves with crystal and china containers, as well as the sheer amount of room space that she alludes to in Psyche. In both paintings, the figure is corseted with upswept hair and a narrow black ribbon around the throat, and she wears a filmy undergarment, which Morisot shows slipping off one shoulder. This is elegant and subtle eroticism, in which the viewer looks at a woman who looks at herself. The inclusion of the mirror references a long academic history of women and mirrors, and titling one of the paintings Psyche would have alluded to that historical context. Morisot was renowned for her virtuosity with paint, for the fluidity and beauty of her impressionist brushstroke, and that is what she employs here to mask the details of the model's body, her face, anything that would distinguish her. In Woman at her Toilette, the figure and the background, the mirror and reflection are virtually indistinguishable. Morisot has merged and blended them into swirls of pastel colors, turned them into a veritable confection of femininity, and in the process, erased any sense of working-class model, a woman who took her clothes off for money. Looking at how Morisot treated these less stressed subjects offers a glimpse into her struggles and her solutions, which are quite different from the male impressionists like Degas. In this painting, Degas shows us a woman sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, perhaps an indication of a small working-class apartment. She is long past drying off after the bath. There is no indication of any tub. He depicts her completely naked, showing just a glimpse of breast, but definitely a breast. She is presumably quite comfortable that way as she combs her hair. Morisot's interpretation is expunged of any such eroticism. Her model sits erect on a chair, and although she was wearing a filmy garment, it is loosely fitted and obscures her body. Her hair is neatly tied up. There is a ribbon around her throat, as if she were waiting for a visitor. While the title and the garment suggest an intimate glimpse of female life, the painting is remarkably straightforward in its modesty and decorum. The closest that Morisot came to the nude was the 1890 painting Before the Mirror, in which the strong linearity of her brushstrokes clearly outlines the breast which is reflected in the mirror. Reflected but obscured, like the model's face, which has been brushed to remove any trace of feature. We could argue that what the artist was attempting to paint was the fragmentation of reflection, the simultaneous and shifting play of light over mirrors, walls, and the body. That would be the stylistic rendition. However, that ignores the context of Morisot's culture and the conventions under which she lived and worked. It seems more honest to admit that the nude was a subject that made her uncomfortable, and what she ended up painting was that discomfort. I began Impressionism by reminding you that in its own time it was controversial because of subject matter, style, and technique. Because of this, the Impressionists were not successful in getting many of their paintings into the salon shows, and in 1874 they decided to exhibit privately and together. Between 1874 and 1886, there were 8 Impressionist exhibitions, although the entire group did not participate in all of these shows. Mounting private shows had begun with Courbet, but increasingly avant-garde artists would opt for their own venues, as well as show paintings informally in restaurants and galleries of friends and supporters. Although most of the Impressionists were not financially strapped, they were all interested in gaining a reputation and making changes in the art world. So whether they sold or not, and some like Morisot hardly ever did, since she despised having to work with tradesmen and agents, it was important for their work to be visible. Private art dealers and agents became important fixtures of the modern art market. They arranged shows, promoted their clients with critics and potential buyers, negotiated for deals and supporters, and got press promotion. From the 1870s on, the rapid progress of art movements, the virtual onslaught of isms, meant that artists working in one stylistic mode were often competing for clients and support against artists working in another. The modern obsession with progress, with stylistic change, and with difference impacted these artists. Working in the Impressionist mode was outdated as avant-garde by the late 1880s. Ironically, Monet's greatest financial success and reputation came in the late 1890s, when the avant-garde barometer had shifted from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism. From the late 1870s on, Monet concentrated on series paintings, making many pictures of a single subject seen under changing conditions of light. Some of these had not been very successful, in particular the 1877 Gare Saint-Lazare series of railroad stations. Ultimately, Monet achieved national fame in 1891 when he pioneered a new exhibition tactic, the one-man, one-subject show. In this case, he showed his Haystack series, a group of paintings done over a 2-year period under all kinds of weather and light conditions. Of the hundreds of canvases he painted, sometimes as many as 25 versions of the same haystack, he exhibited 15 with the intention that the government, always on the lookout for good art, would buy all of them, keeping the series intact as well as the visual experience. The show was a huge success. The catalog included a long introduction, which helped the audience understand the idea of a series of repeated forms as a single subject. The paintings all sold, but not to the government, which had no intention of making such a purchase. Nor were the French big buyers. They were consistently outbid by Americans, who were quite interested in contemporary subjects and less interested in academic art. In a series of letters to his son, fellow impressionist Camille Pissarro harangued about the success of the pictures, noting the high prices that Americans were willing to pay. Pissarro's letters indicate his jealousy at Monet's success. His own moment of fame came later and never with the same degree. He wrote, "The people want nothing but Monets. Apparently, he can't paint enough pictures to meet the demand. Worst of all, they want mules au soleil." Those would be the haystacks in the sun. "I don't understand how Monet can submit to this demand to repeat himself. Such is the terrible consequence of success." Obviously, Monet did not share any of Pissarro's concern over subject matter or success. At his country estate in Giverny, he was able to create a magnificent garden, which included, ultimately, a lily pond and a Japanese bridge. He spent the rest of his life there, painting and selling his works to an ever-growing and more appreciative public. Monet became the grand old man of 19th century modern art, continuing to paint until his death in 1926. By the late 1880s, critics were questioning the value of Impressionism. They argued that as an approach, it relied too heavily on the immediate recording of transitory impressions. They criticized the approach for its lack of form, lack of substance, and lack of control. They criticized the approach for being too haphazard, too feminine. They did not criticize the subject matter, because by then it was accepted that modern art would address modern subjects rather than literary ones. The focus of criticism was on style and brushwork. The idea of recording came dangerously close to the notion of mimetic art, long the nemesis of imagination and creativity. Besides, wasn't recording much like documentation? Wasn't that what cameras did? Although many of the Impressionists worked quickly with rapid brushstrokes, it would be naive to imply that their paintings were carelessly done or conceived without any sense of composition or control. The challenge to Impressionism came from artists like Paul Cézanne, who were interested in a very structured approach to painting, equating structure with rationality and control, and Impressionism with sensuality and emotion. The former was very masculine, the latter too feminine. Like every cultural product of the modern world, where progress and innovation signaled what had to be better, Impressionism would be overwhelmed by a new group of artists, the Post-Impressionists.
Hopefully you have a much more critical understanding of Impressionist painting now, and a better idea of how art historians question, research, and argue for different positions about art. By the end of the 19th century, Impressionism was very popular with mainstream audiences. We saw that with the success that Monet had when he exhibited his Haystack series. But, like Realism, there was a new generation of avant-garde artists, and they found Impressionism lacking. While they appreciated the advances of Impressionism, they had issues with the movement, and that ultimately led to Post-Impressionism, the next movement of modern art. We'll be talking about those issues and about late 19th century sculpture and how that form of fine art moved from academic conventions to a modern approach in the next lecture.